Hey everyone, welcome. I think we'll get started in just a minute. A couple more people are trickling in. All right, I'm impatient. So let's go ahead and get started because I have a lot of stuff I want to talk to you about in this session. So, welcome to Flows, a triggering experience. Not only do I love the pun that is this title, but really the theme of this presentation is flows and triggers are really the same thing. And I just want to show you how they work together. So, if you're an admin, don't be afraid. We're going to look at some code. It's going to be okay. It's going to all make sense. If you're a developer, I hope that it's not a spoiler to tell you that we're going to look at flows today. I am Michelle Regal. I'm the manager of delivery at Carabiner Group, which is a RevOps consulting firm specializing in Salesforce. And if I can get my slide to move forward. So first I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then we're going to go into some kind of important topics I think come into play when we are thinking about flows and triggers, when to use which one. There are a lot of different options now when it comes to flows, so we're going to kind of dive into the scenarios when you need to use those and when it's appropriate to use triggers. We'll do a demo. I'm going to show you a flow and an apex trigger that are doing the exact same thing. So you can kind of see a comparison of how the two different automation tools accomplish the same thing and hopefully lift the veil a little bit on the mystery that is Apex and flows. And then we're going to talk a little bit about trigger management and kind of talk about the philosophy behind programmatic triggers and how that may or may not apply to flows and how you want to think about your flow trigger management. And then I'll set aside time for discussion and Q&A. Please pop your questions over in the chat as they come up. I'll try and check over there periodically so I can answer them within the session, but I'll definitely get to them in the Q&A part. So like I said, I'm Michelle Regal. I am the manager of delivery at Carabiner Group. I also lead the Tulsa Salesforce user group. I'm a certified system architect, and I have my coffee right here. In Tulsa, it is 8:45 in the morning, so definitely going to be sipping that through my conversation with y'all today. Although let's be honest, if it was 5 o'clock at night for me, I'd probably be doing the same thing. All right, let's dig into when to use what. So when we're looking at Apex trigger, the declarative equivalent in Salesforce automations is the record triggered flow. And before, if you needed to do something like complex, like a record triggered flow that had any type of complicated logic, you had to do an Apex trigger because record trigger flows have only existed for the past couple of years. But now that they have this beautiful new tool, we have a little bit of a choice. So thinking about the different scenarios of when you want to use a trigger versus a flow. Um, Use an apex trigger if there is already a trigger for this object, and I will add, and if the trigger is responsible for all of the automation. And the reason that I make that argument is if you have a developer who is managing your automations and who has structured it very nicely into a trigger, keeping all of the automation in that trigger means there's one place to go when something goes wrong with an automation, something needs to be changed. And anything with regard to automations around this particular object, there's one place to go, one source of truth, for lack of a better word. And you have a developer team that can support it already. So I say, don't break it by trying to mix programmatic and declarative tools where you don't need to, where there's an opportunity to keep everything in one place, opt for that. If there is not an existing Apex trigger for that object, then you definitely, and you're supported by admins, you definitely want to go with the flow. Um, so I would add in the argument of if you do have an Apex trigger for that object, but it's not responsible for all of the automation, or you don't have extensive developer support in your org where you can support a code heavy environment, you might want to consider translating a lot of those triggers into record triggered flows and kind of slowly migrating your org off of the code dependency, and that way your org can continue to be supported by the admins, and you don't have as much dependency on developers if they're not dedicated to your Salesforce system, or you depend on third-party developers, etc. Moving everything you can over to a record trigger flow makes sense. Um, Additionally, there are some things that record trigger flows still can't do, and I actually need to update this slide. So undelete, you can actually run a record trigger flow on undelete now, but as of today, you cannot run a record trigger flow that will prevent a record from being deleted. So this is a pretty common use case for Apex triggers of what do we do when we don't want somebody to be able to delete a record that meets a certain set of criteria, right? Like, by and large, maybe we want our AEs to be able to delete accounts because maybe they put it in by mistake or whatever. But if the account has an opportunity associated with it, we don't want them to be able to delete the account. Or if the account is marked as a key account, we don't want anyone to be able to delete it. So putting in that specific criteria that calls the trigger that then will surface an error message and prevent the record from being deleted, that still requires programmatic work. You can't do that in a flow yet because you can't build a flow that errors out. Um, safe harbor, I know that's probably in the works, and I will probably have to update the slide deck again. But for right now, that is the specific use case where you have to go with a trigger. Again, and we're going to look at this when we go through the demo. If you have an object that has or will have a lot of records, and when I say a lot of records, I'm talking about millions and tens of millions, okay, not a couple thousand. Triggers are still more economical than flows. So if you are dealing with a large data volume org, you may still do a lot of your automation using triggers and doing things programmatically rather than flow. Um, you, Triggers also give you more options with running automations asynchronously than flows do. So that's when kind of that comes into play when you have millions and millions of records for this particular type of object. All right. Don't see any questions over in the chat, so we'll keep on trucking. All right. If you have taken the admin exam or studied for the admin exam, you've probably seen something like this. This is not the complete order of operations because honestly, I don't have enough room in the screen to do all of the order of operations, but I did want to show this just to flag some important things that come into play when you're making the decision between flows and triggers and Apex triggers. So the first thing I want to flag is up here in the upper right hand corner. So the before flows, which are the field update flows, actually fire before any of your triggers fire. So if you do have a case where you have record triggered flows and Apex triggered flows running on the same object, know that these are gonna happen first, always. All right. And then when we have after triggers, so after triggers happen here, right after the save, but you don't get to after triggered flows, which are the ones with actions, not the fast field updates, until all the way down here. So your after trigger flows happen after the programmatic triggers. Your before trigger flows happen before the apex before triggers. Simple enough, but also just want to flag that the after trigger flows happen after a lot of stuff. So if you have workflow rules, if you have process builders, please don't have process builders, or process builders calling flows, if you have auto response rules, escalation, entitlement, assignment rules, any of that is going to fire before this after flow. And then, of course, I'm sure you know that if your after flow trigger is updating other records, that's going to cause additional transactions and save orders of executions for those records as well. Any questions about kind of the save order of execution or how the record triggered flows fit into here? All right. So I use the terms before and after, mostly because that's how you will see a programmatic trigger labeled, and that is also what the record trigger flows used to be labeled. But they have helpfully updated the language and flows. So instead of before, they use fast field updates, which gives you a lot of guidance into what scenario you would actually use a before flow versus an after, which is for actions and related records. I have an even simpler one. If you need a record ID, it's after. If you need the record ID, it's always after. It's actions and related records. If you do not need the record ID to do whatever it is you want to do, then it's before. Then it's a fast field update, right? And then between insert or update, i.e., when a new record is created, this is the same, created and insert are the same, or a record is updated, updated and update are the same. That one's easy. Then it's if you're creating a new record, insert. If it's working on an existing record, it's update. So pretty straightforward. So you can just kind of like dig into this little matrix of, all right, I'm creating a new record and I want to make updates to the fields in the record to automatically populate some data based on default values and information and other data in the record. So do I need the record ID? No. So what am I going to use? I'm going to use a new record is created and a fast field update because I don't need the record ID and I'm creating a new record. So you can use that to kind of make your decision of what your flow criteria is going to be. But Michelle, I know you're not asking this, but maybe you are in your head. Why don't I just make all of my flows when a new record is created or updated, right? Because you can do that in a flow. You can't do that in a trigger, by the way. I'll go into kind of a little bit more detail of why I don't recommend doing that, but the quick answer is because it helps you coordinate and store and manage the order of execution of your flows a little bit better if you have them as separate flows. All right, let's talk about scheduling. So schedule triggered flows are pretty limited in terms of how much they can be scheduled. They can run maybe once a day, once a week, once a month. If you need something that's a little more complex, like it needs to run the first Wednesday of the month, you have to put together something called a cron job, which is basically a codified way of telling Salesforce or telling Apex that it needs to run the first Wednesday of the month, or it needs to run every 5 minutes, or it needs to run like on the last day of the month every month, for example. If you need to make API calls, it's easier to manage that with scheduled Apex. That said, your scheduled Apex class can call an automated flow. So if you build an automated flow to do the actual work, the Apex class just has to say, call this flow. And then you write the cron job to call the Apex class, which just calls the flow. So essentially, you can manage all of the automation still in the flow, but to actually do the scheduling, you need to use Apex. All right. Any questions there? Moving on. When do you use process builders and workflows? I know you are all muted, but please say it with me. Never! Or the fires of hell will come and consume you and your org, and it will never be heard from again. Joking, but like right now, you actually can't make new workflow rules, right? Everybody saw that little warning on their org. This is the time, if you have not seen the fire, if the red flags have not been raised, here is your official alert. Start moving your process builders and workflow rules to flows. And I think there's a session in this conference on how to do that and structures, how to leverage the tools in Salesforce to start moving things over as well. So do not build new process builders. Don't do it. Just build a flow. It will make your life easier. Future you will thank you. And workflow rules, you can't build them anyway, but I would say if you need to update a workflow rule, take that as a sign to rebuild it as a flow and deactivate that workflow rule, right? Take advantage of the waving sign full of moving fire that I am putting in front of you right now. No process builders, no workflow rules. There's a reason that this slide deck is about flows. All right, so now I'm going to dig into a demo. First, I'm going to go through a flow. It's going to be a really simple flow, and then I'm going to show you what that looks like as an Apex trigger. So let me switch over to my org. All right. So let's just start up here. My start object. Configuration, pretty simple. Putting it on the account object. I am doing this when a record is updated. And I'm setting the condition of the owner ID is changed. So the use case for this flow is essentially when the account changes ownership, moves to a different sales rep, for example, or moves ownership to a different person, all of the context related to that account should be updated to that new owner. So it's a fairly common use case in business, but it's also fairly simple to do. So I'm pulling in the account object and I'm just checking as to whether or not the owner ID is changed. All right. It is not even letting me choose the only when the record is updated to meet condition requirements because I'm using is changed. This is kind of a holdover from workflows, although they did eventually add it to process builder as well. If you don't understand how this works, then I would highly recommend just building in an is changed requirement, right? For example, if you are checking on, or if you want something to fire when an opportunity is changed, a stage is changed to closed won, then you would have one criteria that checks that the opportunity stage is changed, which is just true or false. It either is or it isn't. And then a field that checks that if the new stage equals closed won, right? So you're saying, is it changed and is it now closed won? Also something that flows can do that you'll see that triggers cannot do. I find it more straightforward to build up here because then I can see exactly what I'm checking on rather than if I just click this down here, I have to kind of guess a little bit. It's not explicitly spelling it out. So I always put it up here. If I want to check if a particular field has been changed, then I add in the is changed criteria. And then for this, since I am now editing the owners of all of the contacts related to this account, do I need the account ID? Yes, I do, because I need to be able to look up all of the contacts related to that account. So I have to use the account ID to do that. So I need to do actions and related records. And if the fact that the contacts were related records didn't spell it out for you, going back to the matrix, we know that we need the account ID to do this. So actions and related records, formerly known as after. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do in this flow is get the related contacts. So pretty simple, get account, I'm pulling the account objects where the account ID, see, I do need the account ID, I wasn't lying, is equals to the account ID for the record I'm currently running this on. Right, so I'm pulling the account ID from the contact field and checking that it's equal to the account ID for this record. And I am storing all of the contact records because I want to update the owner of all the contact records. And I'm only pulling in these 2 fields. I don't need to store all of the fields. It just takes up more space. So I'm just going to pull in the fields I need. Oops. Don't need to scan a QR code either. All right. Now I am creating a loop. One thing I want to flag here is, see update contacts, this little pink box down here and this pink box up here. These pink boxes are DML statements, right? And we'll take a look at what those look like and kind of where they get their name in the trigger. DML statements never go in a loop, because if you put a DML statement in a loop, you are eventually going to hit a governor limit, right? If I put update contacts in a loop, does anybody know how many times you can update a record within a single transaction, what the governor limit is on that, or on DML statements in general? No, way lower than 2000. 100, yes, 100. 150 is the governor limit for SOCL queries. So that's also an important number to remember. So if you happen to have an account that is related to more than 100 contacts, and you put the update contact in here, your update's going to fail, right? You're going to exceed the governor limits. It's going to roll back everything. You're going to have to manually go in and update the owner for 100 plus accounts. That's no fun. Let's just leave the DML outside of the loop, right? Because now it's only running once. If I put it in the loop, it's going to run over and over and over again. So I get one DML statement to update all 100 plus contact records related to this account. It's a very popular account. So what I use instead here are assignments. I'm essentially creating variables to hold the values for the contact. So here let me go to the first part of my loop. So here I am pulling in the current item from loop, the contact I'm looping through, and updating the owner ID to the owner ID of the account, the current record that this trigger is running on, right? That's all I need to do. So I have this variable getting this assignment. And then I am adding this variable, this current loop variable, to this collection of variables, this list of variables called contacts to update. And that's what I'm doing is I'm looping the contacts, update the ID on this contact variable, add that variable to this set, to this group, over and over and over again. Once you're done, update your contacts based on this entire collection of variables, right? So it's updating all of the contacts that went through the loop that I reassigned the owner from their current owner to the new owner, to the new contact, to the new account owner. One DML statement for all of the contact records. No governor limits offended in the making of this flow. All right, any questions about how this flow is set up? You all ready to see the trigger? Some people get scared when I start talking about triggers, but we're going to get through this. I apologize to the programmers who are used to using DX and don't like the non-dark mode capabilities of the developer console, but this is just easier for me to pull up and present from. This is not a trigger. This is a class. Let me switch over to the trigger. All right, this is a trigger. How do I know it's a trigger? Because the first word is trigger, right? Every time you see an Apex trigger, it's going to tell you a trigger because it's going to say trigger up here. Unless you're a very helpful developer, put some comments above the trigger explaining what it does. The first word is going to be trigger. Also, if you look at the file name, it has APXT as opposed to APXC, which is a class. APXT is an Apex trigger. I feel like that's much harder to look at. So you can look down here as a trigger. Also, if you have good naming conventions, the name of it should also say that it's a trigger. So this is a trigger. What am I calling the trigger? Count trigger. So the same way you name your flows, you have to name your triggers. You want to have some sort of naming convention for your triggers. What do I want it to run from? So if you think about the start box in the flow, this is what we're filling out here, right? So what object do I want it to run on? Account. When do I want it to run? After update, right? It has to be after because I'm taking actions to related records because I need the account record ID in order to do what I want to do. So it's going to be after. And I'm not doing this on new accounts, right? So I just need to do it when the account has been updated. Now, the difference between here and that start menu in the flow is I can put criteria in that start menu. I can't put any criteria in this trigger header, right? Every time an account gets updated, it's going to call this trigger, at least to this part. And then I'm creating a couple of collections called maps, right? I'm basically taking the new value of the account records I'm firing on and the old value of the account records I'm firing on. Notice that I said records and not record. A trigger is going to fire on every single account that is updated in that transaction as a batch. What that means is if you do a bulk update using data loader or your data manipulation tool of choice on accounts, you do a mass updates for 1,000 accounts on changing the owner IDs of all of them, it's going to run this trigger on batches of 200 of those accounts at the same time. So what I'm doing is creating a list, a collection of all of these accounts so I can run them all through these processes together, right? In a flow, you're building it so it's running through one account at a time. So if you have 1,000, you're building it with the concept of it's running that flow 1,000 times. If you're using a trigger, it's running it through batches of 200. So if you have 1,000 accounts, it's running through the trigger 5 times. So that's kind of the difference in how a trigger is structured. It's always dealing with, or it's always going with the assumption that there could be more than one account coming through the trigger at a particular time. Whereas a flow, it makes the assumption that there's only one record coming through at a time, triggering the flow at a time. So that's what these maps are. It's just I'm pulling the old values and the new values. And then you'll see if I go down here, I am checking to see if the owner ID of the old account is not equal to the owner ID of the new account. And they're still called leads because I copied this because 90% of writing code is copying from other people. So I apologize for the confusion, but it is actually looking at the account. So I don't have the is changed functionality in an Apex trigger, which is why I have to compare the old value to the new value and see if it's changed. But it's the same thing. I'm checking to see if it's changed. I'm looping through all of the accounts. See, I have a little loop here. It's called a for loop. You know it's called a for loop because it starts with for. So for every account in this map that I just created, basically in all the accounts that are coming through this trigger, loop through every account. And if it meets this criteria, the owner ID has changed. The new records owner ID does not equal the old version of the records owner ID. Then add them to this list. I didn't mention it, but I made a list up here. It is the list I'm going to loop through here, right? So I'm getting all the accounts that I'm going to send through this process. That's how I'm doing this. So a little bit more complex to build that into a trigger. I can't just set this one criteria. I have to kind of collect from all of the accounts that have been updated, which of those accounts meet that criteria, and then add those to the list. And then I'm going to do all of my actions on that list. And again, that has to do with the fact that we need to work with the assumption that there could be more than one account running through this trigger at the same time. All right. Here's just a little check, making sure there's actually stuff in this list, right? Because if I just did a mass update to accounts and I didn't change the owner ID on any of them, then I don't need to do any of the actual work. I don't want to do any of the actual processing, right? So I'm just checking to see if you did a batch update of account, if you updated any of these accounts, do any of them meet this criteria? If at least one does, then I am calling this class. So the other thing about triggers is they don't actually do any of the work. They can because they're Apex code. But if you're a developer, if you're an Apex developer, if you're a responsible Apex developer, you usually make your automation, the actual work that's done, you put that in a class. And the reason for that will kind of go in when we talk about trigger management a little bit. But it enables you to call that piece of automation from multiple places if you need to. So I'm saying for all of the accounts in this list, do this thing in this class. What is this thing doing? Let's jump over to the class. All right, this is a class. I know it's a class because it says class right here. It has some stuff in front of it that has to do with sharing and security. I'm not going to dive into what all of that means right now, but just know that this has to do with sharing and security. Telling you it's a class And then this is what the class is called, right? Again, you have a descriptive name for your class because you have solid naming conventions. This is a method. It doesn't say method, so not as easy to identify as class and trigger, but it will be underneath a class, right? You'll never have a method hanging outside of a class, and it will also tell you exactly what it's going to do because you do naming conventions. So this is going to update contact owners, and then inside these parentheses is the parameter it accepts, right? I'm going to update the opportunity of the contact owners, and I'm going to do it by accepting a list of accounts, right? So here I am passing a list of accounts to this method, and here I have a method that's accepting a list of accounts. Have to match. All right. Now, I'm basically here pulling out, creating a list of account IDs because when I'm doing the loop in my trigger, pull this back up. I'm doing it on contacts where the contact account ID equals the account's account ID. But since I'm dealing with a whole bunch of accounts, potentially, I have to account for all of the contacts that have account IDs that match with any of the account IDs in the list that I'm looking at. So it's a little more complex because I'm building it to handle, again, multiple accounts going through the trigger at the same time. It will work the same way if there's only one account going through the trigger, but this is called bulkifying, which is just kind of building out your code with the assumption that there could be one, tens, hundreds, thousands, millions of records going through this trigger in batches at the same time. So if you accommodate for that, then you're much less likely to have to deal with governor limits. So I'm just creating a little for loop here, right? We got a little for, and it kind of looks like a loop if you use your imagination. It's code, it's not a flow, so it's not going to have the pretty designs. But again, I'm looping through all of the accounts in my account list, in my list of accounts, and I'm adding the ID to this list of account IDs. So now I have a list of account IDs. Here's where I get to do my get contacts. I have a SOCL query, which is really the code version of the get contacts action in your flow. Right? So again, I'm creating a list here because I'm collecting multiple contacts, right? So I have a collection. It's called a collection in the flow, but here I'm using a list. And in my query, I'm selecting the ID, owner ID, and the account owner ID from the contact where their account ID is in this list of account IDs. Right, so very similar to the criteria that I set where it's comparing the contact account IDs to the parent record account ID. The difference is here, I'm accounting for contacts that match up with any account in the database where the owner ID has been changed versus this specific account, right? And again, I'm just pulling in the fields I need. So ID, owner ID, and I'm pulling in the account owner ID. So that's the one field I'm pulling in that's a little bit different from what I pulled in the flow. All right. And here, I'm going to go ahead and create that list variable for contacts to update, right? Just like we did in our flow assignment, adding the variable to contacts to update. I'm going to do the same thing, but before I can do it in Apex, I have to actually create the variable, right? I can't just assign stuff to a variable without creating it. Apex doesn't like that. So here I'm creating the list. It's empty, it doesn't have anything in it. And then when I'm saying for contact C in this list I just queried, here is my for loop that matches this for loop right here. Oops, going backwards. I always get the loop direction wrong because it's counterclockwise or anti-clockwise. I'm UK audience. So I'm going through the for loop and I'm changing the owner ID to the account owner ID, right? Same thing. This is assignment number 1 and this is assignment number 2. So I'm updating the owner ID on the specific contact, and then I'm adding the contact to this list that I created, contacts to update. Same exact thing as the flow. And then when I'm all done with that, I'm updating the contacts. So first, again, this is just a little kind of CYA, cover your butt thing that you do. Check and make sure that your list size is greater than 0, because if there's nothing in the list, there's no point to doing an empty DML statement and wasting one of your limited DML statements. So if there's actually contacts in here that have been up that need to be updated, then update contacts to update, right? Update, update, exact same thing. You just don't have a pink box here. They highlighted in purple. And I think it's also purple in Salesforce DX. I don't remember. This is a DML statement in code. This is a DML statement in flow. And rather than telling it I have to update contacts and base it on the collection, and this is the collection to work with, I just tell it to update this list, right? And the system knows that I'm saying every contact that matches the contact variable in this list is what you're going to update in the database and go through the whole update process. And again, it's going to do this in batches of 200. All right, we got a couple of questions. Very scary. Jennifer, are you still scared, or did I make it a little less scary for you? Bit better, okay. All right, so if my trigger runs on API X and Salesforce retires that API X, am I in trouble? Do I need to hire a developer to fix the trigger, or will it keep doing what it's supposed to do? The answer is it depends. So when an API is retired, it could be there's a particular piece of functionality that is no longer going to work that your class doesn't even touch, right? So if your class is updating contacts, and for example, I think it was API 13 when that got retired, what that meant is there was this chatter object called feed, I think it was called feed item, and that object was retired because it was replaced by another object called chat item, or the reverse, but there's an object that was no longer available. So if you had any code that was running on API version 13 that was referencing that object that was no longer available, that code is absolutely going to break. Would this code break? Probably not. Right? It's not referencing anything that got retired. Best practice, you do want to try and keep your code up to date, which is why I usually tell organizations, if you do not have a developer who can dedicate at least a portion of their time to supporting your Salesforce org, or you have a contracted developer or developer house on retainer to help support the code in your developer org, do not put unmanaged package code in your developer org. Don't let somebody come in and write code if you can't take care of it. You can kind of play around with it in a sandbox, of course, by just clicking up here. So if you go into the code and click on the API version, like you can move it up to the current API and save it. And 9 times out of 10, that'll work as long as the code is pretty straightforward. If it's doing anything to standard objects like accounts and contacts, nothing about them gets retired. It's very rare. If you're doing something or leveraging a function that has been retired, one, you've absolutely been notified by it many times before they actually retire it. And two, it's probably already broken or not working for your system for a load of other reasons, which is why they're retiring it, right? The feature is no longer viable, it doesn't work correctly, it never did what it was supposed to do, or no one is using it. So this is one thing you can do. You can actually open the class, update the API version, see if it saves, right? That's test number 1, and then go through and like play with it in the sandbox and see, go through your full testing script and see if that causes any errors. And it might be as simple as that. So that's a way to kind of double check that whether or not your code needs to be updated for retired APIs. Right. Go on back. Y'all, we're done looking at the code. You did awesome. I hope it is a little bit less scary for everyone. Triggers are just flows with words, right? All right, let's talk about trigger management. So what you saw when I was showing you the Apex trigger is you had your single object trigger, right? You have one trigger per object. So you notice my trigger was called account trigger. There's not account before trigger, account after trigger, account update trigger, account insert trigger. There's account trigger. And every time I need to run an automation, I add before insert, before update, after insert, after update. I can add every single condition under which I want the trigger to fire to that single trigger. And then I have the business logic of when I want to actually call the actions to happen. So for example, on a before update, I want this, this, and this to happen, right? On a before insert, before a record's created, I want this and this to happen. What? I want this to happen 2 times in 2 different cases, unlike everything else. Does this mean I have to write this class or method twice? No, because the genius of the object trigger calling Apex classes. This Apex method only needs to be written once, and you just call it under the different conditions you need to call it. And so if you ever need to update the automation for when there's a before insert or before update, you update it in one place. It's always going to happen consistently. And if there are any errors, there's one place you need to go to fix it. So that's kind of the reasoning behind why trigger management is set up this way, right? So you can reuse code in multiple scenarios. So basically up here, you have your trigger, business logic, and the class does the processes. This is very similar to how they told us to do process builder, right? One process builder per object. And then each node is where all the processes lead. Often you might be calling a flow to do the processing if it was complex processing. Would you apply the same principle from Apex triggers to flow triggers? Jose, I love that you teed it up so well. Should we treat flows like triggers? Or should we think of them like workflow rules? You remember way back in the day when we used to be able to make workflow rules or when they used to be our only option. A workflow rule can do one thing. You have a set of criteria. If it meets the criteria on this object in this situation, then you can do this thing, right? You can do a couple of things. You can create a task, update a field, send out an email, send an outbound message, right? But it's one set of criteria to the set of actions that need to happen. If you need the same set of actions to happen in another set of criteria, you got to rebuild it, right? You can't call a series of actions from the same workflow rules. You can kind of update it, but the entire list of things that needs to happen, you have to re-add it to the flow every single time. So I would say more like workflow rules, but we still have the option of recycling code, recycling processes where we can, similar to how they do with triggers. But in terms of how you want to structure your flows, how you want to think of your flows, I say workflow rules. And there's one reason. The Flow Trigger Explorer. We only got this recently too, y'all. If anybody is very, very new to flows, you're coming in at a great time because they have so many more bells and whistles than we had when it was visual flows and we couldn't do half the stuff. So Flow Trigger Explorer. Has anybody not seen Flow Trigger Explorer? Just put an N in the comments so I know. Flow Trigger Explorer allows you to pull up all of your record triggered flows based on this criteria, right? When an account is created, when an account is updated, when an account is deleted. You can't do undeleted, but I'm sure that's in the works. So you can pull up all of the triggers for a particular scenario, for a particular DML call, for a particular object. And you can see all of your flows this way. Additionally, now the new and improved Flow Trigger Explorer lets you sort your flows so you can tell Salesforce what order you want these things to run in. So you have different criteria running in these different flows. For example, for fast field updates, you can tell it what order to go in, just like you did in Process Builder. So think of this as your process builder, right? You have one object for all of the created, and you have everything that you need listed down here. Now, the advantage of thinking of your flows like workflow rules is one, it's much easier to see what your flows are doing because then you can title your flows according to the action they're taking, right? Just like I titled my method in my Apex trigger and my Apex class, update account owners. I know exactly what that method is doing. It is updating account owners, right? If you have a bunch of flows that are called account before update, account after update, that tells you nothing about what's actually going on. You have to dig into the flow and look through it to see what's actually going on. And I mean, you can try and record all of that stuff in the description, but if you have a lot of automations going on, it's going to fill up real fast. All right, got a couple of notes. So I'm going to switch back to my Flow Trigger Explorer. So to get to Flow Trigger Explorer, you just go to Flows, and there's this button up here right next to New Flow called Flow Trigger Explorer, right? And so here I have account, but I can pull any object I want and any of the available DMLs. And here I can see all of my accounts. So here I have my account. Here, when an account owner changes, update the contact owner. I know exactly what that flow is doing. Now, if there were a bunch of automations going on in that flow, I couldn't name it that. I also can't see the description unless I go in here. So this is an easy way for me to see very quickly exactly what's going on. I only have one flow here, so you can edit the order, but there's only one order that I can go in. Additionally, this flow, remember, has criteria on it. So the flow is only going to get called if the owner ID is changed. What does that mean? That means if I update 1,000 account records and the owner ID is changed in 2 of them, this flow is only going to run twice. If I update an account record and put this as a node, similar to what you would do in Process Builder, right? Put a decision node that said, if the owner ID is changed, then do all of this stuff. This flow is going to run every single time an account gets updated. Even if the account doesn't meet any of the criteria in the flow, it's going to run through each of those decision nodes to see if any of them are true, right? Similar to Process Builder, which is why if you have a lot of records or if you have really complex process builders, some of y'all may be dealing with CPU timeout limit errors, because every time you update a record, it's going through this enormous monster of a process builder, even though it doesn't necessarily meet any of the criteria, or even if it meets a lot of the criteria, right? So this flow, it's about efficiency. It only gets called when it's needed. So that's the second advantage to building it more like you would think of a workflow rule, an action-based, or in the case of, if you're thinking of it in terms of Apex, this is your method, right? But Michelle, you promised us that we could reuse our processes. How can I reuse processes if I have to create a workflow rule of every single one of my flows? Excellent question. Your flows, I don't know why I keep opening this up. I can just switch to here. So within record trigger flows, new and improved, you can now call subflows, right? So you can actually put the action being taken place, all of this stuff, into a subflow the same way that my trigger just put everything into a list and sent it out into a method in a class, right? You send it out into the subflow. And if there's multiple criteria, multiple instances where you want to use that same automation, and you send it to the same subflow, and you have one place where that automation is taking place. All right, that is all I have. Thank you all very much. I know we've gone a little bit over. Any other questions? If a flow updates a field that triggers another flow, will that be part of the same transaction? Yes. Yes, and check the documentation on save order of execution. All right, thank you everybody. It's been really great talking to y'all. I hope this was useful and enjoy the rest of your day.